Welcome, everybody, to the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council's quarterly forum. Our topic of interest for this forum is oak habitat, um, particularly talking about oak habitat, the importance of oak habitat, um, oak insects, um, restoration for oak habitat, and some of the work that has been done for oak mapping, and also a collaborative brochure that has been put together by Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District. So, welcome everybody to this lovely forum. I think oak habitat is dear to a number of people's hearts, so this is a really awesome topic to be talking about today. And our first speaker is Kammy Kern-Korot. She is the senior conservationist at West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. She's going to be talking about oak importance and the historic loss of oak habitat and the current threats to oak habitat. Um, so Kammy, whenever you're ready to pop up your presentation, we're ready for you. Awesome, we can see that presentation. And you are muted, Kammy, just so you know.
Okay, thank you. Trying to move you to my other screen, but it's not working, so you might have to be looking a little sideways. Okay, I wanted to introduce you all to the Oregon white oak tree. I'm gathering if you're here that you probably know about the Oregon white oak, but I'll just give a quick introduction. And as Rochelle indicated, share a little bit about why their Oregon oak and their habitats are threatened, and some of the historical context for the tree, and what some of the threats are, and then just a little bit on what you can do about it. So this is just sort of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. And then most of you probably know the range of Oregon white oak in Oregon is essentially the Willamette Valley into Southern Oregon, where it starts to overlap with the black oak, and it's also common out in the Columbia River Gorge. But it's a very iconic tree and habitat type for Western Oregon, the Willamette Valley in particular. And there's just a lot of really cool attributes of Oregon oak. As you probably know, it loves sun. It's adapted to thin soils, so it can grow places like along the bluffs of the Willamette River and out on the gorge, but it also can grow in, sort of deep valley soils and thrive there. It's a very long-lived tree, so that is something, rather special about it. It can live as long as 500 years. I'm sure you've all seen those big, beautiful old oaks. They can get very tall and very large in height and diameter. They grow from acorns typically, but can, sprout from a mature tree. They start making acorns around age 20 and will stop making acorns, maybe at like age 80. So the really old trees aren't making acorns. And the nice thing about encouraging a big full crown on an Oregon oak is that means it'll make more acorns. And then some of the other nice attributes of Oregon oak is it's wind firm, it's got good lateral roots. So even though it has a really good, strong, deep taproot, it also spreads out laterally. That's helped anchor it. It's drought tolerant, so it's a tree that's really, we're hoping, well suited to future climate change conditions. It's fire resistant, and some of you know, historically Native Americans burned the landscape to keep oak open, and I'll touch on that briefly. But it's adapted to that because the mature trees have really thick bark, and they're very resilient to fire. It's a strong, valuable wood, and in the picture in this slide, you can see some of the mistletoe up in the tree. So that's important for wildlife. Birds use lichen for their nesting material. And it's food and habitat for many species, which I'll touch on. So we've got kind of two primary habitat types for Oregon oak. We've got woodland and we've got savanna. And so in the woodlands, even though it's a woodland, it's not necessarily a forest. It can turn into a forest condition. But when we think of woodlands, we're thinking of, sort of a setting where there's still a somewhat open canopy, so it's not completely shaded out. There's light hitting the floor of the woodland so that other plants can grow there as well. So you'll find shrubs, grasses, and wildflowers. And if it's a savanna, it's really more of an open grassland with just some scattered trees. But you do have some really special and unique, wildflowers and native grasses that grow in those habitats. And you'll see some of those still further south in the Willamette Valley, but these are increasingly rare. So there's a continuum when we talk about oak habitats from prairie to forest. And so the prairie, as I mentioned, prairie and savanna, the prairie is potentially where you maybe don't have any trees. We have wet prairie. And those are conditions where, like Oregon oak trees don't grow very well. But then as you get into sort of more dry, prairie or savanna, then you may start to see trees. And then as the trees get more dense, particularly if they haven't had the benefit of being managed with fire, they become or stay as woodlands or potentially even get extra dense and become forests. So historically, for the last 10 to 20,000 years, oak habitat has been a managed landscape by Native Americans. So just to give you a sense of the historical context and what's been lost, on the left is a representation of Oregon oak habitats in the Willamette Valley in 1850. And then as of 2004, which is 20 years ago already, but as you can see on the right slide, you have to really zoom in to see those patches of remaining habitat. So we've lost a whole lot on the right side. You'll see the percentages estimated for what was remaining back in 2004, and we've continued to lose those habitats. So it's just a call to save and restore what we can going forward. So some of why it's a big deal to either preserve or lose our Oregon oak habitat. Savannas in particular are one of the most endangered ecosystems in North America. They're also the most biodiverse, huge diversity of species. They're very productive. There's been 200 plus, wildlife species identified. And those are like the big animals with the vertebra spine. There's 6 or more endangered species associated with Oregon oak habitats. Some of our butterflies, as you might know, and they have really important cultural value. Which I kind of mentioned, but they provide, food for humans as well as wildlife, and they've been seriously in decline, as you can see. And they're unique. The Oregon white oak occurs only in Northwest North America on the whole planet, so it's kind of our special treat. And it's been in decline for 150 years, so that's why it's a big deal. And then just touching on the cultural context briefly, some of the open habitats where you'll find oak, have meadows that support camas, and that's a very important first food for Native Americans. And also acorns are a really important food source historically, ground into flour and made into, cakes, and a really good protein source, particularly for food in the winter. So we like to always remember that aspect of Oregon oak and its landscape. There's so much biodiversity in the Oregon oak landscape. This is just an example of some of the vertebrates, invertebrates, and wildflowers that occur in the habitat. We've got the white-breasted nuthatch, which is the bird on the right. That's sort of like the iconic bird of Oregon white oak habitat. And the western gray squirrel, lower right corner, is sort of the animal that's associated with Oregon white oak the most. But there's just so many benefits to the trees. 150 different species have been documented. I guess it depends what source you look at, you get different numbers. But I just provided a list of just some of the animals that benefit from from it. Many eat the acorns. Others are grazing on the leaves or benefiting from sort of the understory. Oaks can be kind of messy, as you know, so they break their limbs and they have these little craggy crevices where birds can nest, woodpeckers can poke into the dead and dying branches and get food. So they're just really rich in food and sort of nesting for different animals. Keying it a little bit on the plants in particular, there's been 714 plant species identified with grassland, and some of the plants that you might know that are special, that are one rare and one common, the pale larkspur and the meadow checker mallow. So meadow checker mallow is pretty common, pale larkspur pretty rare, both associated with Oregon oak habitats. Just giving you an idea of the full range of just the diversity and abundance of species. And here are some of the beautiful wildflowers you might find in an Oregon oak habitat. Just giving you all a flavor. And then don't forget the insects. I think Rebekah is going to talk about insects later. But there's as many as 1,000 insect species supported by Oregon oak habitat. Some of the, sort of beautiful charismatic ones we know about are the Fender's blue butterfly that's endangered, but there's all sorts of, anonymous insects that are being supported. And even if you don't care about insects for themselves, they're the bottom of the food chain. So, that's what our birds eat. And everything else sort of high up in the food chain ultimately benefits from those insects. So be cautious with insecticides. And those wildflowers attract pollinators, certain type of insect that we all tend to really appreciate. Among other things, they pollinate a lot of the food plants that we eat. And sometimes people might not appreciate the value of even just one big old oak tree in an agricultural field. So there was a study that was done that showed that those trees that are remaining out there are still really important. They're considered a keystone structure. So those big trees really do matter. And this one study found 47 different bird species using them. So they are habitat magnets, and we encourage folks to hang on to those trees. So what are the threats? There's land conversion to agriculture and urbanization. The tree photo I have in the bottom there is an example of a tree in Wilsonville where there's been a lot of urbanization and the oaks there are stressed as a result. And then there's that loss of disturbance from fire. Oregon oak actually benefits from that kind of disturbance. In some cases, flooding, if they're in well-drained soils, that kind of keeps some of the competition at bay that would potentially outcompete Oregon oak. And then, of course, we have invasive weed species. On the right is a picture of a woodland actually in West Multnomah district boundaries where spurge oil, an invasive species, has been moving into the understory of the Oregon oak woodland. So that's something that we're trying to manage. And then Douglas fir is actually a very competitive tree when it comes to Oregon oak. So if you have fir encroaching on Oregon oak, that can be problematic. And if that woodland isn't being actively managed, that can end up leading to the loss of those Oregon oak. And then, of course, there's damage done to individual trees, whether that's just people, accidentally mowing up against it and nicking the bark, digging in by its roots, things like that. And then habitat fragmentation is a big deal. While those big, beautiful trees in the farm fields are important, if they're, the only trees on the landscape, then the wildlife can't, move from place to place to find what they need. So oak habitat, some of the things that you can do is maintain what's out there already, the trees and the associated plant communities, remove invasive weeds. I've got an example here of English ivy that was taking over an Oregon oak woodland on Sophie Island. And we work with the landowner to, control the ivy, remove competing firs, as I mentioned, plant new oaks and associated species. So on the right is a picture of a oak seedling that we planted. And then, in addition to just the oaks, focus on the other plants around the oaks and enjoy the oak habitat and the wildlife that use it. There's a red-breasted nuthatch. So other things you can do, sort of alluded to this, is care for your oaks. If you're lucky enough to have an oak on your property or in a community space, you help manage or steward. Ideally avoid lawns because non-native grasses in particular soak up a lot of moisture, and so we can sort of outcompete the oak for water. Be careful with irrigation. Oaks don't like too much water, and also avoid fertilizing. They're actually kind of adapted to, not the richest of soils. Avoid compaction and tillage and paving. That can be a big source of stress on the trees. Don't park your vehicles under the oak. Ideally leave sort of an undisturbed area under the canopy, and ideally like two times the diameter of the tree, if you can, the diameter of the canopy, that is. Don't over prune, leave the leaves if you can, because that's returning those nutrients back to the tree through the soil. And then if you don't have a rural property, but you have an urban property, or you just want to do something beneficial around your home, there's something we call meadowscaping, where you can kind of create like a mini oak habitat on your property. And we have a guide called the Meadowscaping Handbook for that. So in summary, I don't know how I'm doing on time, Rochelle, but I'm just going to wrap things up. We had as much as 1 million acres of Oregon oak habitat, and now we have less than 50,000, and this number is rather old, so I'm sure it's smaller than that. We have somewhere around 100 wildlife species that it supports, 200 insect species, 700 plant species, and we want to really protect what we have, including those big old granny trees, we'd like to call them, add more trees, connect the habitat we have, spread the word about how great Oregon oak is and what you can do to support it. Plant an acorn or a seedling and sow meadow seed and or plant plugs. You get them in little containers. So that's pretty much what I have. I have a list of some resources here for folks if they're interested, where to get seed, some great guides that have been put out, and organizations that you can work with, including your Watershed Council and your Spill and Water Conservation District.
Thank you so much, Kammy. That was really great. Our next presenter is Jake Barker, and he is our OSU Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Forester for Columbia, Washington, and Yamhill County. And Jake will be covering restoration and management of Oregon white oak habitat. And Jake, we are ready for your presentation whenever you are.
All right. Thank you all. I'm gonna see if I can get this pulled up here. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
We can
All
see
right.
that, just so
You can
you're.
see that?
Yep.
Okay. Notes. Okay, I'm gonna do my best here. I don't have my notes in front of me. They're embedded in the slide deck, so sorry about that. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I have a couple minutes here to talk about a really big topic. So Kammy gave a great overview, kind of like on the ecology and what we're looking at in terms of habitat loss for Oregon white oak. And I think that paints a perhaps sad but an accurate picture. And I hope that in my short time here, I can give some thoughts and ideas about how you would think about managing oak in a more forest context. So thank you so much for having me. So just a brief overview of what I'm gonna try to cover today. Talk about some oak ecology. We'll talk about oak silviculture, which will include a pop quiz, so be ready. Then I'll talk about management approaches and then discuss a case study. So one of the things I had the opportunity to do recently was attend some educational field tours in Connecticut for a national forestry convention. So the photo here in the center is the older gentleman is a longtime legendary extension forester in Connecticut, and we were visiting an adaptive silviculture oak site near Hartford. So we were looking at red oak management. Here they were doing the innovative approach of planting seedlings, which is not commonly done in New England. So we had a really interesting site visit there, and it's cool to go across the country and meet other professionals and learn from folks who are thinking about oak and are managing oak in a more floristically diverse forest than we have here, but there's a lot to be learned. The photo on the right is from Chehalis Ridge Nature Park, where there's an amazing series of oak habitats ranging from sort of like oak woodland to oak savanna. And they've done a lot of work up there to restore back to that native condition. So diving into the ecology of Oregon white oak, as Kammy mentioned, it's the only native oak species to the Northwest, part of North America, and its range spans this massive latitude from Central California and Southern California up all the way into BC. So that's pretty unique. It also spans an incredible array of elevation. So it lives at low elevation and up to 3,000 feet in California and into like 1,800, 2,000 feet in Oregon and Washington. So it's an incredibly adaptable species and it can grow in a wide range of conditions climatically, which is really unique and really crucial for land managers and for foresters in our area. It can persist on mostly it's found on more xeric or dry sites. When in the Columbia County context, we're thinking like those kind of exposed rocks along the side of Highway 30, where the soils are really shallow and droughty, and oak has a great time there. And you'll find that condition if you go east into Oregon, along the Columbia, you'll find more of that kind of dry site Oregon oak habitat out there. But it can also persist on the wet sites. And that's what makes it such an adaptable species for our areas, that it has this ability to work with dry conditions and wet conditions and have its feet wet for a handful of weeks of the year. It's associated with an incredibly long list of species, as Kammy was sort of alluded to there. So from a vegetation standpoint, there's a ton of different micro types of habitat that oak persists in. It's correlated with a variety of different other tree species and vegetation. I don't have enough time to like go into it, but there's a really nice array where you can look at like what's the vegetation cover beneath the oak, and you can get a sense of how dry is it or how moist is it. Probably the most common one in the Willamette Valley, especially, is the association with Pacific poison oak and common snowberry. Um, so that's kind of a ground base for the range. To get into the ecology of reproduction and early growth, and I'm talking about this mostly just to give us more insight into this tree. And the next slide will be a little bit more relevant to management, but it's a early flowering tree compared to other tree species. It's dioecious, or sorry, it's monoecious, so it has both male and female flowers on the tree. It's mostly pollinated by wind, but as Kammy mentioned, there's over 200 insects that absolutely love oak. Mostly they're going and picking up pollen from the catkins, um, but it's self-pollinating to create its acorns. Mostly it does, sorry, it's late flowering. I said early. It's late flowering, but that timing does depend on the elevation or latitude that you're talking about. Um, and to get into the seed production, this is, I think one of the more important components of oak for a variety of reasons, both for its historical and cultural use as a food producing tree for humans and for tribes and for wildlife. But the main thing too is that this also influences the way that oaks regenerate and how they persist year to year and over time. Um, so once those flowers are pollinated, it turns into a fruit that is rather large. And so most trees, especially in the Northwest, when we think of their cones or their seeds, they're very small, but the acorn is relatively large, right? It's about 1.5 inches across and it can range in size, but in terms of an actual seed size, that's a pretty good amount of energy that's going to be present for that germinating seedling. So it produces an array of acorns. It's often there's usually a big flush of acorns, so it's not something that's always going to be consistent year to year. And there's not a ton of research on how this happens, but it's a really key component when we're thinking about management. Um, Often these acorns are just falling down from the tree. Some are being squirreled away, no pun intended, by rodents and lightly buried, but mostly they're falling by gravity. If it's on a hill, they'll roll a little bit. So in terms of how far the seed can go, it's not very far compared to, say, wind dispersed seeds of riparian trees that have an ability to move a lot further distance. Oaks are rather limited in terms of how far their seed can travel. One of the unique parts about oak is because of the genetics of what we've looked at in terms of that span of range, the actual genetics of Oregon white oak are pretty small in terms of the diversity. And so there's some theory that actually, because of its relevance for human use for thousands of years, that humans have actually like facilitated the movement and spread of Oregon white oak. And that's why we see such a similar genetics, because they were favoring the same kind of trees over and over that were good nut producing trees. So anyway, that's a fun fact. Oak can also reproduce vegetatively. So instead of producing seeds with new genetically unique individuals, it can reproduce via root sprouts or through stump sprouts. So when oak trees are cut, they're notorious for stump sprouting, and this can be a great way to regenerate trees if you need to. I'll get more into that later, but it's not typically the common pathway. They are capable of it because they are a hardwood. But again, not a particularly common approach in terms of management. So as we move kind of out of that seed and flower component, when we look into seeing how the trees grow over time, they can grow in a variety of different conditions. They can grow up to, or they can grow over 100 feet tall, greater than 30 inches in diameter, and they can have over 100 feet of canopy spread. But really, the main thing we think about with oak is whether the trees have been grown out in the open or if they've been grown within the context of a forest. So if they're grown in tight spacing, they will develop straight, clear boles as they're competing for sunlight, versus trees that have been grown out in the open in the more oak savanna condition. They're gonna grow branches early on and create that kind of classic oak look, right? So that's the classic decurrent growth structure, different, say, than a conifer, which continues to have that main leader throughout the course of its life. They found that there is a kind of varying growth rates with Oregon white oak, roughly ranging like 16 to 20 rings per inch. And you can have a variety of stems per acre. You can have really low density oak, or you can have upwards of 1,000 stems per acre. Basal area also varies depending on the habitat, the site productivity, as well as past land use. So you can have really low component of oak up to like almost pure oak stands. As oak trees develop, they do have a relatively deep tap root, which allows it to survive in those droughty conditions, but it also has a really well-developed lateral root system, which gives it a really good anchoring system for wind conditions and wind disturbance. Competition is something we think a lot about with trees in terms of how they grow. Oregon white oak is interesting because generally it's classified as intermediate shade tolerance, but it also can be very shade intolerant. So depending on the site, it can be shaded out pretty heavily. So what this means is that, and Kammy sort of alluded to this already, is that oak does a really good job growing in that sort of mid-shade condition. So it can do well out in the open and it can survive with some encroaching growth of other trees above it. But if it gets fully shaded out, it will decline. So one of the key things with competition is that in the Northwest, we have really fast growing conifers, particularly the Douglas fir. And so in places where either Douglas fir is growing and expanding, or people have planted Douglas fir, we often see this conifer encroachment. So the conifers, which are able to do photosynthesis for a longer period of time of the year, have faster growing rates. They're a softwood. Um, they have a different growth form. They have a different, approach to being a tree in the world. They're going to be able to grow faster and outcompete these oaks. So this is a common dynamic in places like abandoned agricultural grazing areas with an oak component. Douglas fir comes in and can grow past the oak and shade it out. However, oak can be self-perpetuating in some cases. So in places where it doesn't have that competition, oak can grow to maturity, it can regenerate and keep going. So this means that oak can be both a cereal and a climax species. What we mean by cereal is that it might just be a stage within the forest development. So given that forest type, oak might be the second species that's dominant in the canopy, and then it might proceed to another tree species that's more dominant in the canopy. But it can also be the climax species. It's relatively long-lived, so it can be in the canopy for decades and hundreds of years, and that may influence the way you think about management. Kammy also referenced that fire has played a huge role in terms of where oak are and how they've persisted, and low scale or low intensity ground fire keeps back that competing vegetation to ensure that there isn't any competition moving up into the canopy. And with long history of fire suppression and fire exclusion, we've lost a lot of that sort of natural component that is influencing vegetation dynamics, and much of that fire was put on the ground by humans, by tribes. So that is a key component of the picture when we think about oak ecology. Um, so as we kind of dive into the silviculture of what it actually looks like to manage oak trees, when we think about silviculture, we think really about these three components, and I've added a fourth one here because what we mostly want to talk about is restoration. But within a silvicultural cycle, which is the full process uh, of regenerating, of tending, of growing trees, and then eventually harvesting them. You begin with the regeneration treatment. This is also known as like your harvest treatment. Um, then that moves into establishment treatments or intermediate treatments. So all those things work together to achieve your goals. So as a land manager, you're going to implement different types of treatments within a different system to achieve different goals, depending on what your objectives are. Restoration treatments are sort of this like other approach because it can, and especially with Oregon oak, it can kind of bump it out to a different type of cycle. Um, so with oak for establishment, most cases across North America, oak is regenerating through natural regeneration, typically with what we call advanced regeneration. So because of the acorns and the seeds are larger, they have an energy store. One of the best methods for regenerating is waiting to get a good acorn flush. You do an initial removal of light once those acorns are on the ground and you've got that seed bank established. And then once that light dynamic changes, that those seedlings then have an opportunity to sprout and really start to take off. So that's typically how it is done in more mixed hardwood forest types. Again, the context in Oregon is slightly different, but that's typically how that works, is relying on that advanced regeneration, which is periodic, right? It's not necessarily every year you're going to have that ability, but it might be every 5 to 7 years. In our context, there's a lot of folks who rely on planting of oak trees to do that establishment phase. This is really key in our restoration approaches where we're trying to get back to an oak woodland or an oak savanna where we've potentially lost that seed source. Once the forest stands move into a older age class, but while they're still, in that 10 to 20 to 30 years old, a little older, but growing vigorously, you can go in and you can do some tending and thinning. That's going to be, to essentially maintain and achieve your desired wood quality. Again, a little bit less relevant for Oregon oak in terms of wood quality, but thinning is a huge, huge important approach to oak management to reduce competition, especially with warming temperatures and persistent drought, just to reduce below ground competition and be thinning stands and clumps of trees. When it comes to regeneration, typically, again, the approach would be, a shelter wood treatment or a clear cut treatment. Both of these are removing a sufficient amount of the overstory to get more light down to the understory to regenerate that next cohort of trees. But today I really want to talk more about restoration, and I'm probably running out of time here soon, so I'm going to try to zip by this. The main thing with oak when we think about restoration is approaching it with a method that we call crop tree release. So again, this was developed mostly in New England, looking at New England and the Southeast, looking at hardwood management. But we place a quadrant on top of our tree if you're looking at it aerially, and you're going to have the four different quadrants. And you're really going to want to achieve that sort of release factor by pulling away the competition of other trees that are growing within the canopy. So this sort of diagram here shows that the darker green trees are far enough away that you wouldn't necessarily need to release the oak, but the lighter green one is close enough that you would remove that in order to release it. And there's a lot of great research. This Devine and Harrington paper from 2013 basically just shows that oak has an amazing capacity to respond to release, especially full release, so released on all sides. Um, and a lot of their ideas are that because oak is long-lived, it knows how to respond when growing conditions change, and because it has a significant root system, it has the capacity to pull on the resources available once the light conditions change. Again, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to actually skip the quiz and we can come back to it in the questions if we want to. So why do we restore oak? Well, Cammy's alluded to a lot of great things, but your goals might be to enhance forest diversity across a given landscape or area, or to increase bird or invertebrate diversity, to enhance your wildlife habitat, or to achieve just sort of a more ecological restoration goal. The key things to keep in mind for restoration is that you want to ensure that you have quality oak for your objectives. So doing oak restoration where you don't have enough oak that's growing well and healthy, you might do your restoration, and then it might be really hard to get the oak there in the numbers that you want. You also need enough conifer volume to offset the costs. So removing the Douglas fir, sending it to a mill, and getting the receipts from that can help pay for these treatments. It's also key to think about its proximity to other oak habitat, right, to try to create that connectivity. The other key thing is coming up with maintenance plans and options going forward, because that ongoing maintenance of the understory is really crucial in oak woodlands, as they are very prone to invasive plant growth because the light dynamics are different than in more closed canopy conifer forests. And so because of that complexity, often it's really great to look for multiple funding sources and other partner organizations or agencies who support the work. So from an operational standpoint, right, it's really important to think about your oak density. So how many trees per acre do you have, or what's your basal area of oak? You want to be really careful about residual stem damage. So especially when you're removing those larger conifer trees, they got to come out somehow. And so you want to be really careful about minimizing damage to your residual oaks. The quantity and quality of your Douglas fir will also influence projects. So If you don't have high value Doug fir, it's going to be harder to make those numbers pan out. Again, ongoing vegetation management is important. And a key thing here is that typically when you do oak release or restoration, you're going to be dropping beneath the Oregon Department of Forestry's basal area requirement for forests. And so you often need to develop a plan for alternative practice with your ODF forester because of that change. I think I'm running out of time here, so I'm gonna just end on economics here because I think this is a big one. Um,
You have
so Keith,
you have 6 minutes, Jake, if you
okay, okay, perfect, thanks. Um, so big things with economics are access. So road costs and maintenance are huge drivers of cost. So if you have places that already have access, that's great, especially if they've got good roads. That can be a driver of whether or not projects can or can't happen. The optimal size for oak restoration projects are between 20 and 50 acres because you're increasing that footprint, which gives you more access to the conifer volume to offset the costs. These are sort of ballpark numbers that I am pulling from a colleague at Trout Mountain Forestry from a presentation he gave. Typically, you're going to need about between 300 and 500 MBF of Douglas fir volume to sort of offset that project. So that can be a helpful number to keep in mind if you're going out and you're doing your inventory or your cruise. You're trying to identify like how big of an oak area to work with but you're not meeting that 300 MBF threshold, you might need to look for another area or reconsider your approach. Um, Typically, you're going to want to do mechanical treatment with a skidder and a tractor or a skid steer, mostly because the felling is going to be pretty tricky, especially to remove larger conifers within an oak standpoint or within an oak stand. Just it's high risk, going to be a lot of breakage, and you can be more, especially if you have a mobile head on the harvester, you can be more ginger as you take that tree out and lay it down where you want it to go. Cost to do this work can be anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 per acre, which is an incredibly wide range. But it can be pretty expensive depending on the site and conditions. Um, so when you're thinking about revenues, you're shooting for about 75 loads worth of material that are going to come off the project. Um, and if you're assuming, $3,000 a load for saw logs and $600 a load of pulp, and you kind of balance that out, that's essentially what you're going to try to shoot for if you're trying to do a larger oak project. So what I wanted to also provide today was just a quick case study of a project I'm working on, which I'm really excited about. It's not in Columbia County, but it's just nearby in Washington County. So it's just southwest of Hag Lake. This is a small OSU research forest that is 180 acres and has a really excellent oak component that has been around for a long time. This was originally a dairy farm that went actually down into Hag Lake before it became the reservoir. And then once the reservoir was created, it was no longer feasible to run a dairy, so they transitioned it to a tree farm. So a lot of this, especially on the eastern side here, is kind of these upland ridges that are slightly drier, and they have a fair component of large, older, mature oak that many have been overtopped by conifer. Um, this forest on the west side also has a sort of historic conifer element as well. So this side over here along the creeks was more western red cedar, grand fir, and that's been there for a long time as well. So it has this unique blend of having these older conifer forests as well as an oak component from an older canopy. I guess I already talked about this a little bit, but this is one of my favorite pictures of the forest, which is a patch cut that was a salvage from storm damage, and one of the residual trees that was left behind was this little oak that actually has its top broken off, and it's just thrilled to have growing space again. And there's like two more in this area. So we know that oak love this space, and we know that it grows well here, and it responds to it responds to changing light conditions. Here we're doing this is still a timber stand, so that we've replanted Douglas fir here, which will one day shade out the oak again. But for now, the oak is providing a really key habitat, providing some critical shade, and is, great spot for birds as well. So in our upcoming project for this coming year, we are putting together like a 15-acre project that has 4 different units actually. The main objective being doing this oak restoration in on this dry ridge, and then in this kind of more lowland area that has a lot of Doug fir mortality. And we're offsetting that with 2 group selection units, which are small patch cuts essentially, that will have variable retention trees left behind as well. But the harvest from those group selection units will help pay for the rest of the work. So it's about 10 acres of oak restorations where we'll be releasing mature oaks by removing conifer. And then we're going to really be relying on existing roads and skid roads. So this helps keep our costs down. We're going to connect these 2 little oak restoration units by an existing skid trail. What's really nice is that there's a little educational trail that walks right through that smaller northern oak restoration unit, which is a key part of what we want to do with these forests, is demonstrate what we're doing and then showcase and teach the outcomes. So this is slated for summer 2026. Because of this approach, these oak restoration units, the smaller ones are small enough, but the larger unit, because we're dropping it below that basal area threshold and we're not going to be reforesting, we had to work with ODF to say, hey, here's what we're working with, here's the unit size, here's our goals, here's our plan for vegetation management going forward. But essentially, this unit is pulled out of our forest in terms of timber production. So when we're thinking about larger scale operational planning, that functionally changes that stand from being within the rotation of normal timber production to an oak stand, which is going to be managed on a much longer rotation. It may never actually be harvested again. So that's something to keep in mind. We also have the benefits of being close to a sawmill for the conifers, so that means that our haul distance is really short. Our big question is trying to figure out our ongoing vegetation management. We're going to likely do a combination of mastication, herbicide, and spreading native seed to kind of reset that understory. We're hoping someday to put fire back on the ground here, but it's hard to know if that is going to be feasible, and really just keeping an eye on the invasive plants. So I think I'm probably at time there. I'm happy to talk as much as anyone wants to talk about on this stuff because it's really exciting, and I think it has an opportunity to showcase sort of an innovative approach that can be daunting for landowners.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was really wonderful. And next up, our next speaker is Rebekah Gaxiola. I'm probably butchering your last name. I'm so sorry. She is a resource conservationist at the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District. Rebekah is going to talk about oak insects and then give us probably I believe, a little brief update on our local, or the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District's local Scappoose Airport Oak Restoration Project.
So I was trying to unmute myself. I think you pronounced it right. I wasn't paying attention. But it's Gaxiola. Okay, let me share my screen here. Are you seeing? You can see it?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. Alrighty. Yeah, as Rochelle mentioned, I'm with the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'll be talking about 2 separate but kind of related things, Oregon white oak insects and then our restoration project at the Scappoose Airport. And I guess just to introduce myself real quick, because there's a lot of people in the room that I don't know yet. I've been with the SWCD for about 8 months. I work primarily with landowners on technical and financial assistance for conservation practices and planning. building up programs for agricultural landowners in the county. And as with most SWCD employees or conservationists in general, kind of a jack of all trades. My background is in wildlife ecology. I worked with native pollinators for a number of years, and then recently, a couple years ago, finished up my master's at Washington State University, Vancouver, just over the river, where I studied impacts of nitrogen deposition on Oregon white oak chemistry and insect herbivory out in the Columbia River Gorge. Here's a couple pictures from my field sites. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. I've run around oak habitat for a number of years looking at bugs, so I thought it would be a fun addition to the lineup of presentations today. And there's been a few numbers thrown around, and there are reasons for all those different numbers, but the numbers I got are over 800 native insects associated with Oregon white oak. And that's everything from butterflies to wasps to beetles to insects you may have never heard of, like midges and leafhoppers and scales. I don't think that this group needs convincing that oaks are a really important part of every ecosystem. They provide services like pollination and decomposition. They're an incredibly important food source for a lot of other wildlife, like birds and small mammals. And oaks in general host the most abundant and diverse insect communities out of any other tree genus in North America. There's a number of reasons for that. One being that they've just been around for a long time evolutionarily. They also have really strong defenses against herbivory, which can help drive speciation and as insects adapt over time. So kind of take a step back for a quick and talk about plant defenses against herbivory, and then we'll jump back to oaks. Whoops, I said back, but I meant forward. Okay. So starting with physical defenses, we have things like thorns and spines and prickles that are made mostly for larger herbivores to prevent them from eating plant tissue. And when it comes to insects, we have things like trichomes, which are, let me get my little laser pointer. Here's an example up here. They're just little hairs on the plant surface. This one's on the stems here. Some of them are just a physical block to eating plant tissue. Some are glandular and will secrete a chemical, like the hairs on a stinging nettle. Those are trichomes. And plants can also develop really tough tissue that makes it hard for little insect mouth parts to penetrate. Plants will more often have chemical defenses against herbivory, and you're probably more familiar with plant chemical defenses than you might think. All of these are chemical compounds that can serve a number of purposes, but are also a defense against herbivory. Some of these chemicals are really mild and maybe just like taste bitter or make it harder to digest nutrients. And then some of them are really toxic, like cardiac glycosides in milkweed and foxgloves, or cyclotoxin in poison hemlock. And different animals will respond differently to these different chemical defenses. Some of them adapt and tolerate them, or some, like monarch caterpillars, will evolve to sequester the toxins, and then it makes themselves toxic to predators. So back to oaks. Oaks have really high levels of tannins, which are toxic to insect herbivores, but not so toxic that they can't eat them. It just slows them down developmentally. They're also this pointer responsible for leaves turning brown in the fall, and they also help with decomposition. So they have other purposes too. Oaks also produce lignin, which toughens the leaves and makes it harder to digest. It's not toxic, but it physically slows herbivores down. And leaves earlier in the season will have less lignin development, so they're a lot more supple and edible, and that's when a lot of insect herbivory is happening. And then later in the season, they'll kind of toughen up. White oaks also have trichomes, those little hairs I was talking about. These are on the undersides of the leaves, and it just makes it harder for the insects to eat the leaf tissue and also navigate around the leaves. And lastly, they'll emit volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which are kind of like pheromones, to signal predators and parasitoids that there's food for them. Sends that chemical signal out into the atmosphere and draws them in. And I'll talk a little bit more about parasitoids in a second, but they're a type of predator. Most of them are wasps, but they'll lay their eggs inside of another insect, and then the larvae hatches and eats the insect. A quick note about when insects are interacting with oaks. There's a few different life strategies of different insects. We're all probably familiar with this like caterpillar to butterfly pipeline. But some insects just have a smaller nymph stage and don't go through such a drastic transformation. And insects are interacting at all stages of their life cycle typically, but a lot of that herbivory is when they're in this larval stage. They're trying to race to develop and eat as much as they can before something eats them or before the leaves become too tough to eat. And then when are insects interacting with oaks during their life cycle? Again, kind of at all stages. Most of that leaf herbivory is happening in the early spring and summer. And some insects have multiple generations in a year. Most insects are overwintering in the leaf litter, so they're active, not active, but they're around in the wintertime. They're just in the leaf litter or in the soil, usually in a late larval stage or in their pupal stage. And then in the spring, when everything warms up, they'll emerge and continue on their little life cycle. We group herbivorous insects into these different feeding types. I don't have time to talk about all of them today, but most every part of the oak is edible to some kind of insect. We'll be talking about these, mostly the top two, and then I'll touch on a wood-boring insect at the end. But there's all kinds of insects. I would love to talk more about them later if you want to talk about them. Jumping into defoliators, these are the insects that are eating the leaves. They can be all kinds of insects, moths, beetles, sawflies. Most are just little caterpillar-looking grubs. As soon as it's warm enough outside, like I said, they'll be on the leaves eating leaf tissue. We break them down into these different eating habits. There's chewing insects that are just taking big chunks out of the leaves, skeletonizing that are eating all of kind of the soft tissue in between the veins, and they leave behind this little lacy pattern. These are sawfly larvae down here. And mining insects that are eating the tissue in between the two leaf cuticle layers where all that lignin is. And they create these little tunnels or patches of missing leaf tissue. But I'd point out a few examples of native insects. Again, there's a lot, so I don't have a ton of time to go over these, but this is a dusky wing. It's a type of skipper butterfly that's obligate on Oregon white oak, meaning the larvae only eat Oregon white oak. The adults preferentially nectar on camas. And once the larvae develop, they will make themselves a little silk cocoon and drop down into the leaf litter where they overwinter as a larvae, and then in the spring they'll pupate and emerge. They are in Washington State, they're designated a species of greatest conservation need because of oak habitat loss. I couldn't get to the bottom of it. I don't think they're like listed anywhere in Oregon, but definitely in Washington. Here's an Ilia underwing. This is a moth that's also an oak obligate. These are a bit more common. They're found throughout the US. They're really common on the East Coast. I think they're one of the more interesting caterpillars because the larvae are this like green and black mottled bumpy texture that mimics the lichens that grow on the trunks and the branches, and it will camouflage them from predators. It's a California sister butterfly, also an oak obligate. It's really common in California, obviously, but it's found down from Baja up to here. We're kind of at the top end of its range, but I've seen these in Oregon. I haven't seen them in Columbia County yet, but they should be here, so you can keep an eye out for them. And then one more native defoliator that's kind of a pseudo pest for oaks is a western oak looper. They'll have these outbreaks that last for a year or two where they defoliate the entire tree and make the trees look dead. The oaks usually bounce back after the outbreak's over, but it looks really messy and bad for a year or two. They will feed on other tree species that don't do so well as oaks, like conifers, but they're not regrowing their needles every year, so they're a bit more detrimental to other tree species. Okay, well, jumping over to galls, which are my favorite. These are abnormal growths of plant tissue that kind of like a tumor or a wart that are triggered by something external, like an insect or a virus or a bacteria. There's dozens of oak galls. on Oregon white oak, and most are caused by synapid wasps, which are really, really tiny, probably smaller than you can picture in your head. They're usually like the size of a grain of rice or smaller. And the wasps will lay their eggs in developing plant tissue, which triggers the plant to kind of grow around the larvae and create this little home and a food source for the developing larva. I will talk a bit about the one on the right and then show some more examples. This is a speckled gall wasp. These are pretty common in Oregon. And the inside of the gall is mostly hollow with these little fibers, and the larvae is inside the center, their chamber in the middle, where it eats the soft tissue that kind of forms around it. This is the adult, again, really tiny, like the size of a grain of rice. This is a parasitoid wasp that lays its eggs in the larvae of the speckled gall wasp. And you can see this long ovipositor here. That's the organ it uses to lay its eggs. Over time, these guys evolved really long ovipositors because the galls would get bigger, and then the ovipositor needed to get longer so that it could reach the larvae in the middle of the gall. And they've been in this kind of evolutionary arms race to outgrow each other. This relationship kind of plays out for a lot of insects, especially on oak. It's what drives speciation and diversity. And yeah, now we'll look at some other galls on Oregon white oak. Some are fuzzy. These are all 3 different species, and each little ball is contains little developing larvae on the inside. Okay, I made a note here. If you have trypophobia, is that what it's called, where you don't like the little holes? Close your eyes for the next slide, and I'll tell you when to open them again. But close your eyes now. These are what I think are the ugly ones, even though I still think they're cute. But these are kind of cluster galls, and each one of these little holes is an exit hole that a little wasp came out of. Okay, you can open your eyes again. These are, they just get really wacky, and these are all found in Oregon. I've seen a few of them in Columbia County. I've seen more of them when I was doing my field work on the east side of the gorge, but they get pretty crazy. And a few more that I couldn't fit on the previous slide. There's still a lot we have to learn about galls. Like a lot of these we don't know what insect is associated with them. We just know that they're their own distinct type of gall. I'll post a few resources at the end where you can contribute to like community science projects. So if you see anything fun, which if you're looking, you will, like there are galls everywhere, you can contribute to that. Okay, switching gears to something not so fun. Wanted to talk about an invasive insect to keep an eye out for when you're in oak habitat. This is the Mediterranean oak borer, MOB. It's a newish invasive species that we're still learning a lot about. It's an ambrosia beetle that carries a fungus that causes oak wilt. They will bore into the wood carrying this fungus. And then the fungus grows and they feed the fungus to the young. We have native ambrosia beetles. They typically only infest trees that are already dying, and they can help like speed up decomposition. They're not normally a pest, but MOB, we're not exactly sure yet. It seems to be attacking some healthy trees, and we aren't really sure yet how it's going to impact Oregon white oak. So we're on the lookout. It was first detected in 2018. We're kind of expecting to see it in Columbia County in the next couple of years. So you want to keep an eye out for it. I realize this is the same picture that Kammy had on her slide. I was like, that tree looks really familiar. But this is a tree with MOB. You want to look for these big, large sections of canopy die-off where it's like the entire branch section here, and then pale boring dust at the base of the trunk. So when they're in there boring their little holes, they're kind of kicking the sawdust out. And if you see something, report it to the invasive species hotline. Definitely recommend taking pictures. It really helps the folks on the other end of the invasive species hotline prioritize and kind of weed out normal oak damage. One other insect to keep an eye out for is spongy moth. This was an insect brought to the US in the 1800s for silk production and didn't end up going the way we had hoped. It was only first detected in Oregon in 1979, and there's been multiple reintroductions, but we've been really effective at detecting it and treating it. If you've seen these little green delta traps hanging up, those are what those are out for, to catch spongy moth. And this is on the East Coast here. They haven't been so lucky over there. It's defoliated over 80 million acres of trees. They eat other species other than oak, but they prefer oak. And you want to look out for these tan spongy egg masses on hard surfaces like trees, firewood, or yard equipment. Again, if you see something, report it to the invasive species hotline, take pictures. For stuff like this too, it helps if you can take a photo of something in it for scale, like your finger. Okay, I think I'm doing okay on time. Right. But I want to end the insect part on a happy note. I hope you learned something about oak insects and that you get to get outside and see some of these guys the next time you're in oak habitat. I popped outside of our office earlier this week to take a quick picture of the oak in our parking lot, just to point out all of the evidence of insect activity that might be pretty easily overlooked. Like I said, it's there if you look for it, and it's pretty fun to look for. If you want to know what to do to help support native insects, Kammy mentioned this, but leave the leaves. As I mentioned, a lot of those insects are overwintering in the leaf litter. It's part of a really healthy oak ecosystem. If you have oak leaves in your yard, try to leave them, try to at least, if you need to like move them out of the way of sidewalks or things like that, at least try to contain them and not throw them away or burn them. And a couple more resources if that was not enough insect information for you. And here are the places I was talking about. If you are out and about in oak habitat and see a cool insect, there's a couple different websites that you can post those to help people like me out. Okay, now hard left, going to talk about a restoration project at the Scappoose Airport. This is a Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board grant that my fellow resource conservationists, Crystalline and Amber, got awarded last year before I got here, so I'm speaking on their behalf. The goals are to develop a model for oak preservation and restoration in Columbia County. They've been, but yeah, also to continue invasive species removal that they've been doing since 2018. This property is owned by the Port of Columbia County. They've been really great about letting us out there to do invasive species removal and then develop this restoration project. But it's about 8 acres of two different little stands of Oregon white oak. So our plan is we're in the early processes, which is why I didn't want to spend a ton of time talking about it because we already had presenters talking about the importance of restoring oak habitat, but we'll be thinning. We've started thinning out these 8 acres of crowded oak forest and planting and maintaining a native understory. We have a lot of partnerships with this one. As I mentioned, it's owned by the Port of Columbia County. We've had Oregon Department of Forestry seasonal fire crew out a few times to do trainings. We've worked with Jake with OSU Extension on kind of management planning and hosting workshops. Worked with a lot of local contractors, and we've, as I mentioned, hosted 1 workshop already. We plan on doing some more out there and having some volunteer opportunities for people to get involved. I think we're hoping next summer to host a little bat box building workshop in the forest using wood that we've harvested from the thinning this year. So if you're interested, you can keep an eye out on our website or social media, or you can get in touch with me and I can put you on a list somewhere to send you some information when that's available. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Becca. That was wonderful. And last up of our presenters is Sophie Verdoorn. She is the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council's GIS and watershed technician. She's going to talk about some of the oak mapping that's been done and our collaborative oak brochure.
Hello. I'm going to put my presentation in the chat so you can scroll along and click any links while I go along that you want to explore further. And then I will share my screen. All right, I'm going to be talking about Oregon white oak specifically in the Scappoose Bay watershed. Tree inventories are a really important piece of data that we look at as conservationists and resource managers trying to manage at a landscape level and at a smaller level. And so the Intertwined Oak Prairie Working Group worked to create oak distribution data and maps in between 2014 and 2017 through community scientist mapping, so people going out into their communities and logging trees on apps like iNaturalist, and through aerial imagery. And this project is named Oak Quest, and the extent of it is their regional conservation strategy plan area. So it's mainly in the Willamette area surrounding Portland, and we were lucky enough to be included in their plan area. So we have really great data for oaks within our watershed. This project was a huge undertaking, took 5 years, and would not have been possible without many organizations, partners, and community scientists. So for more information about this project and the many people involved, you can click those 2 links. And in one of those links, if you follow it, is this data, publicly accessible. You can see the pink is representing oak, and you can just scroll to where you live or where you're interested in, and you can see a variety of different. Can you see this part of the presentation where I'm seeing the different maps?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So you can also see high value habitat, its associations with different land cover, the topology, and then you can also look at patches of oak woodland habitat, which I will be talking about later. So I encourage you to explore those links. So if you aren't familiar, Scappoose Bay Watershed goes from about the bottom end of Sauvie Island to about the middle of St. Helens and all of the footlands and hills above that. And we have 5 sub-watersheds that all flow into the Scappoose Bay right here. So as many people have talked about before me, historically, oak habitat, which was a much larger portion of forested habitat in Western Oregon, and through land development, land use changes, that habitat has shrunk significantly and become fragmented, meaning those what once would have been a continuous connected distribution of habitat is now just a little island spotted around the state. And so we'll get into the first map we're going to explore here, and you can explore this on your screen too. So we scroll in a little bit more. This is the oak forest restoration project that Rebekah was just talking about. So the little pink dots are individual oak trees, and then the red outline is what is considered oak woodland patches. So the oak woodland patches are one of the areas where at least 30% of the canopy cover is oak. And this shows how oak woodlands have a larger habitat footprint than just the separated oak trees within them. And you can also visualize how a single oak tree has a lot less habitat footprint than, say, a single tree that is surrounded by other trees, not of the oak species, but they're still providing greater habitat by being connected to other trees and other natural spaces. And this park that we're looking at right here is a recent restoration project of ours, the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, and there are now oak seedlings running along this restoration riparian area to join this little oak tree on the other side. And so when you click on these oak patches, you can see that they are scored. And this can help us determine high value versus lower value oak habitat, and they're scored based on 5 different indicators. Patch size based on species territory scores. So these oak habitats support specific species like white-breasted nuthatch, Oregon acorn woodpecker, and western gray squirrels. And those species need specific territory sizes. So they scored these patches based on the minimum sizes you need to support those animals, and then relative size of the oak patch. So when comparing patches to the other patches within the full study area, how big is this patch relative to other patches? Percentage of oak canopy within a patch, percentage of patch bordered by natural land cover scores. So if a patch is bordered by grass, agricultural area, or other vegetated areas, it's going to be a higher score than if it was surrounded by developed areas, roads, or buildings. And then percentage of the area of oak woodland within a certain radius. And so we can zoom out and see different oak woodland patches and how they're scored and what determines those scores. So when we're looking at it from a landscape manager view, we can look at those indicators and see what maybe we could improve when we're looking at projects in that area, or a landowner is coming to us and saying, hey, how can I improve the habitat in this area? We can look at maybe they want to, in this case, they removed a lot of invasive species, which will probably up the percentage of oak canopy within the patch. Or if they have room, they could expand the size of the oak patch. And going back to this little small oak tree, it might not seem like it's providing a lot of habitat value, just this one oak tree, but when you consider the newly planted trees we did here, and then when we zoom out, you can see it's connecting to all these other oaks. So it is providing some measure of habitat connectivity within the greater landscape. And moving on to talk about connectivity, oak woodland habitat is extremely fragmented, and species that rely on that habitat have a difficult time moving in between these islands of habitat. So in order to determine habitat corridors, paths that connect isolated patches of habitat, the oak woodland patches were determined and scored to be determined connectivity and habitat cores. These cores are high scoring oak woodland patches that represent high value and important habitat for connectivity. So we have 5 of those patches within the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. These 2 down here are Oak Island. It's a nature trail you can visit, and it's managed by the Oregon, I believe, Wildlife ODF and W. And then this one right here is in the middle of a city, St. Helens, and it is mostly owned by the city of St. Helens and the Port of Columbia County. And then this one up here is owned by a private timber company. And so when we're looking at this from an advocacy standpoint, we can see those high value important habitats, and make sure we're communicating that value to the people who own the land, and urging them not to develop those sites, and keep them as intact habitats. And then we can also look at, for habitat connectivity, if Western gray squirrels are trying to move around from habitat to habitat, they're going to have a hard time getting between these. But it's really important for biodiversity to have different populations intermixing and going back and forth, so we can see how we can improve the corridor of habitat connectivity between these two places. So we could look at improving the habitat in McCormick Park and this park right here, and Nob Hill Nature Park, which is down here, which is all oak habitat. So if a gray squirrel could somehow make it in between these places, they would still have a hard time getting across Highway 30 right here. And so we could start advocating for a wildlife passage in between these two high value habitats. And there was also a recent study that was published about amphibians in, sorry about the ads, amphibians in Columbia County and these two sites. And that's by Jonathan Hakib, Matt DeGrossa, and Alita Quinn. And in this paper, these two sites were identified to be one of 5 extremely important sites for amphibians in the county, hosting and supporting a high diversity of amphibians. And so we can also be communicating that to the community and to the people who own these lands when we're advocating for the preservation of these sites. I'll cover that. And then I will wrap up this forum by talking about oaks you can visit. So this brochure pamphlet was created in partnership between the Scappoose Bay, West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District. And it was inspired by the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District's The Oaks We Share guide. So if you're not local to our area, but you are local to the Hillsborough area, you can go see oaks in your area as well with this guide. But you can see all of these trees on this map are public areas where you can go see oaks and the habitat that they create around them. And then a little guide about how to ID it, honoring the land and who originally lived here, and more information about that. And you can pick up one of these pamphlets at any of the tabling events that we are at, or at our office if you would like a hard copy. And I will also plug that many of these sites have volunteer work parties you can contribute to. If you want to contribute to the restoration of oaks in your area, you can join the Friends of Nob Hill Nature Park, or follow us on social media to work on restoration at the Chief Conley Park, or right across the way from that, where we just planted new oaks, Veterans Park. We have a work party coming up next Saturday, not this Saturday, if you would like to contribute to oak restoration in your area.
Thank you, Sophie. That was wonderful. And at this time, I'd like to open the forum up to any questions to any of the folks that are here with us. Feel free to raise your hand, or you can ask your questions in the chat. Yeah, does anybody have any questions for any of our speakers? And Becca just put her contact information in the chat as well, or if anybody wants to be linked up with any of the speakers, feel free to email our info at email and we can connect you with anybody that was here today. Go ahead, Cliff.
Hey, so this is a question for anybody who presented. I work with the Nature Conservancy down in the southern Willamette Valley right now. And for the longest time, I've had not a problem, more so just like a miscommunication or just issues with connecting with small landowners on this sort of conservation on sort of a very small scale rather than our like wide approach to conservation. I think connecting with those small landowners is really important, and I'm just wondering how any of the presenters or anyone here has done that.
I guess I could go first. I'm sure others have something to say. Yeah, so I'm with the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. So we cover all of Sophie Island and the western part of Multnomah County. And, restoring oak habitat has been a priority for us for some time. We work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service and our partners in Clackamas at the Soil and Water Conservation District there and developed a funding pool for oak habitat restoration. And then we've done multiple mailings related to that funding pool, as well as just protecting your oak in general, and more recently specific to Mediterranean oak borer and letting folks know that they had oaks on their property and that they were potentially at risk. So we've done some targeted mailings to folks, using GIS and where we think we have oaks. We've done some of that based on our oak mapping data, so because we know generally where those people are. We've also done, outreach and education through like local community groups, whether through the Grange or like we have rural community associations here. So we give presentations, we've given talks. It's not necessarily the easiest, kind of sell, because it's not like required by any kind of like land use rules the way like forest stewardship planning is. And then there's the tax implications. So it kind of takes a special kind of landowner that's motivated to do it. But yeah, we've really tried all those tools, and I've gotten to landowners different ways. Sometimes it's been through a mailing, sometimes it's been, an article that I wrote in that local community association that sparked their interest. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to offer there. And we have web pages and e-newsletters and always promoting opportunities to work with us on oak habitat.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, are there any other questions? We did have a comment. Caroline said, "Thank you for advocating for oak habitat protection." And both Jake and Kammy put their emails in the chat.
And if anybody just has a comment, right, or something to add.
Yeah,
Michelle,
we'd love to hear any comments if anybody has any comments.
I can say that I really enjoyed Becca's presentation. I love learning about the insects. I'm always looking at those defoliated leaves going, what's eating these leaves? So that was great. And
We did get a comment, perhaps could someone speak to the role of ambassadors? I have two we added to our home in 2022, so I think they've added 2 oak to their home.
can that person clarify what they mean by ambassadors? Like, is that because of the wording I used?
Oh, just sorry, everybody. There's been a lot of in-depth information about how to manage an oak habitat in the wild, and really the deep dive there. I just had space for the two. So, what is the benefit of encouraging people to follow this path and add an oak to their house in somewhere in Portland, not like a massive habitat restoration, but something that individuals can do.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I tried, and I'll let the others add whatever they want to add, but for West Multnomah, which includes the west side of Portland, I did include in my presentation, you know, the meadowscaping program and sort of the concept. And we also have sort of a follow-on to that that's actually called, like, well, we call it for short oakscaping, but it's like suburban oaks, managing oaks in your suburban landscape, something like that. If you go to our website, and I can try to put the link in the chat, we have that. But the concept is very much that urban folks can contribute to that. And if you're looking at those sort of connectivity maps, you know, that can be helpful to see where those gaps are. But, you know, in my opinion, any oak is a good oak, any Oregon white oak. And the more the folks that can just plant a few or protect a few, you're contributing to that connectivity and are enhancing that connectivity. So yeah, by all means, I think we all support that, encourage that. And you know, some of those materials we developed are like specifically geared toward urban folks or folks that just have a small area of land to work with. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but yay to you, and we definitely want to see more of that.
Yeah, and Caroline wanted to add, good program, thanks. Hopefully Mediterranean oak borer won't be a big issue. And then might want to mention not transporting firewood in case it's infected. So I did want to touch on that. We are encouraging folks not to move firewood, or take firewood and go camping with it. Really like buying or getting firewood from where you are is going to be important to not spread pests, not just for the Mediterranean oak borer, but for emerald ash borer and other invasive insects as well.
Rochelle, if I could add to the ambassador question, I
Yeah.
was just thinking about it when we had the really bad ice storm a few years ago. A lot of Oregon oak were damaged and came down, particularly in like the Oregon City, you know, that area that's really, really oak rich. Probably happened up there in Columbia County as well. Definitely happened within our district also. And it sort of spooked some landowners that like they just wanted to like they were thinking of starting to proactively like remove their oaks. And so there was an effort to like work with a really knowledgeable arborist who works with oaks to kind of educate people like don't freak out, don't go cut down your oaks. So yeah, I guess as part of being an ambassador, like all of us, if we can sort of spread the word about how important the trees are, don't, you know, hopefully like don't overreact to concerns like that. Like don't go proactive removing your oak trees. They're so valuable. You know, make sure you're really being intentional about what's needed, get the best advice you can. You know, if you do think you have a sick tree or a limb needs to be pruned, just, you know, be really intentional about that and not, you know, not go from a place of fear. And if you have neighbors that are, you know, thinking that way, to the extent that you can kind of coax them into, you know, taking a step back, talking to a really knowledgeable arborist, maybe those trees don't have to go, or can be just really thoughtfully pruned, as well as just promoting oaks in general as valuable and needing good care and not being paved over and things like that. And of course, talking to your elected officials who care about protection is another option.
Those are all really great points. Did we have any other questions from the group or comments? I think that this has been really a wonderful forum, and I really want to thank all of the speakers again for your time to come out and speak and talk about the importance of Oregon white oak habitat, and all of the work that you do as well.
And thanks to everybody who showed up that also cares about Oregon oak. We appreciate all of you.